without being caught up in the political games occurring inside of the halls of Congress.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, may I ask consent to speak for up to 15 minutes as if in morning business?
Without objection.
Mr. President, a colleague recently described on this floor his experience flying in a private aircraft when a fire broke out in the cockpit of the plane. He observed that putting out the fire distracted the pilots from flying the aircraft, and that they precipitously lost altitude. Just so, this Tea Party shutdown and the Tea Party's threat to our country's credit, like that fire in the cockpit, are distracting us from flying the plane. And I dispute the notion that those who caused the shutdown have good standing to come to this floor and criticize the way the Obama administration is implementing a shutdown that we don't want on our side of the aisle, that the Obama administration does not want. The Tea Party and Speaker Boehner, for their insistence on lighting that fire in the cockpit, are answerable to history and to their consciences. But in the spirit of getting back to flying the plane, I will talk, as I usually have, about a real and looming crisis, not the man-made fire that the Tea Party has lit in the cockpit of our government. That Tea Party shutdown can end tomorrow, like that, if the Speaker of the House will simply call up the measure that the Senate has passed. He refuses to do so, and it is his continued indulgence that keeps this shutdown going. Well, Mr. President, climate change is for real. It's not man-made. It's not something the Speaker can turn off with a vote. It's coming at us, and it's time to wake up to what carbon pollution is doing to our atmosphere and oceans. Regrettably, one of the reasons Congress is still asleep is that the worst culprits, the big corporations that do the worst carbon polluting, are pretending that it's not that bad, that it's not serious. They should keep doing what they're doing. The status quo is fine. And it causes me to wonder why it is that corporations seem never to admit that they're wrong. Why is oops a word they just can't seem to use? When it turned out that people would be a lot safer with seat belts, did the car industry say, oops, we should have put those in and put seat belts into the cars? No, they fought and they had to be defeated. Then we got seat belts. When the cigarette makers found out that their product made people really addicted and really sick, did they say, oops, we better figure out a way not to kill so many people? No. They fought and they lied for decades. When it turned out that lead paint damaged children's brains, did the lead paint companies say, oops, we better warn folks about that and clean it up? No, they fought against protections and had to be defeated. Indeed, they're still fighting. When it turned out that aerosol refrigerants and propellants were eating away at the Earth's ozone layer, did the manufacturers say, oops, that's dangerous, we'd better come up with a safer product? No, they fought the change, but they lost. And now, they're making money making those new, safer products. When acid rain was killing off the fish in northeastern lakes, did the big utilities say, oops, we'd better clean up our emissions? No, they fought the changes until they were forced to clean up. When the flame retardant industry found out its product was both dangerous and ineffective, has it said, oops, this flame retardant stuff is hurting people and doing really creepy things in nature, we'd better knock it off? Nope. It's still fighting, while whales turn into swimming toxic waste. And now that carbon pollution has blown through 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, a first in human history. and has launched the most rapid acidification ever seen in the oceans, and by that I mean going back into geologic time, are the polluters saying, oops, we'd better take our billions of dollars in profits and our trillions of dollars in capital and invest seriously in new fuels and power sources? Fat chance. Corporations that are harming people never say oops. And for two big reasons. One, there's lots and lots of money at stake. They wouldn't be in the business if they weren't making money, and they don't want to stop. Two, corporations don't have consciences. They have reputations. A reputation is something you can manage, and huge chunks of Madison Avenue and K Street are dedicated to managing corporate reputations. So with no conscience and only a reputation, you manage the problem that you're harming people. By now, the strategy for managing a corporate reputation while hurting people is well developed. It's a common one across cigarettes, acid rain, lead paint, flame retardants, refrigerants, and now carbon pollution. There is a playbook. And guess what? The big carbon polluters are following the playbook. One, pretend to care. That's important. Two, attack the science. And if you can't attack the science, attack the scientists themselves. Three, claim it will cost consumers a fortune. And four, make your goal not victory, but doubt. So, pretend to care. I don't know if you remember those phony baloney Exxon ads that were all over the place a little while ago with guys in lab coats, and they had these lucite molecules floating around. They wanted you to believe they were really out there looking for tomorrow's clean fuels. Well, you got had. Since 2005, ExxonMobil has been making tens of billions of dollars in profit every year. And it's hard to pick through their numbers, but sources report that over that same time it only spent tens of millions per year on clean energy, about what it spent on advertising. They spent as much advertising their clean energy, it appears, as they did investing in it. And it was a tiny fraction of their profits, let alone their revenues. Remember BP and their green sun baloney? BP pulled completely out of solar and completely out of U.S. wind investments once it had laid down a fat barrage of advertising about being beyond petroleum. Pretend to care. Attack the science, and even the scientists themselves. Now this, the polluters have to do through proxies. Nobody will really believe it if Exxon's fingerprints are all over the attack on the science. So others do the dirty work. One example is Virginia's Tea Party Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli, who attacked the top climate scientist at the University of Virginia. He used his powers of office, the special powers of office that are entrusted to attorneys general. Having been an attorney general, I know something about how precious and special those powers are. And he used them to harass and subpoena a college professor. Well, UVA's lawyers stuck up for the professor, and the Virginia Supreme Court threw that nonsense out. But for the polluters behind it, it was right out of the playbook. You may remember the polluters whipping up a phony scandal called ClimateGate, pretending that a group of climate scientists was doing dishonest work. The scientists had to endure audit after audit after audit, every single one of which gave them a totally clean bill of health. Turned out it was the cooked-up phony scandal that was dishonest. But the polluters, they had had a field day in the meantime, right out of the playbook. Claim it will cost consumers a fortune. This is a playbook classic. The big polluters are always talking about it will cost you to clean up their act. Implicit is that they're going to put all the costs onto you, that they're not going to eat any of it, that their shareholders aren't going to bear any of it. But let's get past that. What they conveniently overlook is that, for instance, under the Clean Air Act, complying with the Clean Air Act did cost utilities a lot of money. But for every $1 that was spent cleaning up to comply with the Clean Air Act, Americans have saved about $40. They spend $1, you save $40, and they want you to believe that's a big problem? The Office of Management and Budget does a little calculation called the social cost of carbon. The latest cost is $36 per ton of CO2 emitted. Every ton of carbon pollution the polluters don't sell, we save $36. But they'll never tell you that side of the story, nor that there are more jobs now in green energy than in the entire oil and gas industry, nor that we are in an international race for tomorrow's clean energy technology innovations. And it's a race these big international corporations are perfectly happy to have America lose. It is no skin off their nose. And last, their goal is not victory, it is doubt. They don't want to convince anyone that climate change isn't happening. They don't need to do that. And of course, they couldn't do that in any kind of a fair debate. All they need to do, the playbook strategy, is to convince you as you're driving down the road, listening to the radio, that nobody's really sure yet, that there's some doubt, that we don't need to do anything just yet, that you can move on to your next worry. This one's still up for grabs. And they will keep trying to put action on carbon pollution and push it over that horizon of doubt, never having to prove their case. You, the American people, are being played for chumps in this game. It's a racket, and you're the mark. Even so, even with all of that, the facts around us, what's happening to our woods and shores and farms and weather, are becoming so clear that even with the playbook, they're losing, just like they ultimately lost on cigarettes and seatbelts, on lead paint and acid rain and the ozone hole. Here's what Americans are saying. 61% of Americans say the effects of climate change are already affecting them personally, or they see it happening in their lifetime. 58% said the country should do more to address climate change, including 51% of independents, while just 14% said we're doing enough already. 65% of voters support, and I quote, the president taking significant steps to address climate change now. 65%. And that number jumps up to 70% when looking at voters under 40 years old. 66% of young voters, 2 out of every 3, say climate change is a problem to address, while just 27% say climate change is a natural event that humans can't affect. And only 3% don't believe climate change is happening. 53% of people say they'd be less likely to vote for a politician who did not understand that climate change is a real problem. Even in Texas, even in the red state of Texas, 70% believe global warming is happening, and more than half say that more should be done about global warming at all levels of government. Today is day 10 of the Tea Party shutdown. As we've pointed out over and over again, it is a manufactured crisis. It goes away the instant that Speaker Boehner stands up in the House, calls the measure that the Senate has passed without amendments, without gimmicks, calls the measure the Senate has passed to the floor. It will pass. The crisis will be over. This crisis, this is different. This is not a crisis, a fire in the cockpit that's being kept burning by Speaker Boehner, who could stop it at any time. This is for real. This is Mother Nature. 400 parts per million for the first time in 800,000 years is serious. The Tea Party Republicans are wildly out of step with the American people on both issues, and it is time for them to wake up. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
May I ask the distinguished senator from Georgia to yield for 1 moment. I ask unanimous consent that senators on the majority side be limited to 10 minutes each until 1 p.m.
Without objection.
Mr. President,
Senator from Georgia.
I ask to be recognized for up to 8 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, on August the 28th of this year, the 6 federally regulators of the banking industry reported out on their charge to promulgate a rule required by Dodd-Frank known as the QRM rule, or the Qualified Residential Mortgage. The Qualified Residential Mortgage Rule was a rule that Senator Landrieu, Senator Hagan, and I put into the Dodd-Frank legislation to provide for a parameter for residential mortgage loans to be exempted from the risk retention requirements of Dodd-Frank if they met a certain standard. And these regulators were charged with establishing that standard. That law passed over 5 years ago, and we're just now getting to the promulgation of the rule. But I'm happy to say that I rise today on the floor of the Senate to memorialize my support for a job well done. The Qualified Residential Mortgage Rule, which is being circulated now until October 28th, is the right answer for the requirement of Dodd-Frank and for the American housing industry. For the education of the Senate and the public at large, the Dodd-Frank law and desire to make sure that loans that were underwritten were better underwritten and loans that were made were better made loans so there'd be less default and less problems in the housing industry required the banking industry to make only qualified residential mortgages as defined. The original discussions by the banking industry was part of that definition would be a required 20% down payment, which I and many, many people in America strenuously objected to because a 20% requirement to exempt from risk retention would be far too great a down payment for most American families to meet, would have probably meant a decline in the housing market even greater than we experienced in 2008, 9, 10, and 11, and would have had a negative impact on America's economy, unemployment, and America's health and well-being. So the banking regulators did a great job in their rule, which does the following. First of all, it equates QRM, or the Qualified Residential Mortgage Rule, with the QM rule, the Qualified Mortgage Rule, which Richard Cordray, the director of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, promulgated about a year ago. Mr. Cordray did an outstanding job of seeking input from people in industry and the trades that are affected by the housing industry and wrote a rule that made sense. That rule required the following. It required good, solid underwriting, a maximum ratio of total debts to total gross income of 43% so that you would not have somebody borrowing more than half of their take-home pay or their gross pay in order to service debts. That would mean people would have the money to pay their mortgages. Required people verify their income, verify their credit, verify their employment, and verify the value of the property that's being purchased with a loan. All those things are the standards that served America well for years until the subprime lending took place from 1999 through 2006. So I commend Richard Cordray and the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau for defining a qualified mortgage as one that is well underwritten. A required down payment is not necessary to have a qualified mortgage because underwriting was what led us into the difficulties of the past 5 years in the housing industry. We went through a recession that was not a down payment recession, but it was an underwriting recession. When Congress itself was partially to blame when it mandated that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae hold a certain percentage of their portfolios in what was known as qualified residential mortgages for the purposes of meeting underserved people in society. Those underserved people in society ended up being credit risk or higher credit risk. They became known as subprime lenders. They got guaranteed by the government. They were sold in securities, and when they defaulted, the securities went down, the American housing industry went down, the American Federal Reserve had to bail out people like AIG, and we went through the worst housing crisis in the history of the United States of America. So by the proposal by the 6 banking regulators to merge QRM and QM, they are recognizing that underwriting is the key to sound loans. And by requiring good underwriting to exempt from the 5% risk retention required in Dodd-Frank, we're ensuring a robust housing market, robust and available capital through Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, and through private institutions to ensure housing in America can return to the heights it's known in the past. And, Mr. President, quite frankly, we're never going to get below 7% unemployment. We're never going to get higher than 2% growth in America and our economy until we return to a robust housing market. And we're not going to return to a robust housing market until we get liquidity in the credit markets for residential mortgages of a conventional nature. And that's only going to happen when Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae can make well underwritten loans, can secure well underwritten loans and guarantee them so they can be sold in the marketplace. The banking regulators who are now circulating the QRM rule for public comment did precisely the right thing to recognize underwriting was the problem, not down payment. Now, lastly, in my comments, one of the things the regulators did put in their proposal for circulation for input was, what if they did require a down payment of 30%? Would that be an exemption for the risk retention of under QRM? And I would implore the regulators not to consider doing that, because a 30% down payment would be even worse than 20%. It would restrict even more Americans from being able to be homeowners, and it would not address the problem. The problem was underwriting. The problem was not down payment. Credit enhancements such as private mortgage insurance and things of that nature can supplant a down payment requirement, but nothing can supplant quality underwriting. Richard Cordray wrote a good rule. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau is enforcing that good rule, and I commend the bank regulators for merging the QRM rule with the QM definition to ensure that we return to a robust economy, a strong housing market. Don't revisit the problems of the past with shoddy underwriting, and instead look forward to a brighter future for the American housing market. And I yield back the balance of my time.
President.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I have watched for nearly 2 weeks the debate here on the Senate floor and as well on the House floor, and I've just become more and more frustrated. And my frustration is in part, and I say in large part, driven by the contrast to see what I see what's going on in my home state of Colorado. During the past several weeks, we've come together in the wake of biblical rains and beyond devastating flooding to begin the long process of rebuilding our state better and stronger. We in the West, and I think I could say we as Americans, are rugged cooperators. Sure, we're each strong individuals, and that's no bigger a point of view in the West. It's at the core of who we are, that we're strong as individuals. But we know we're best when we band together, despite any political or philosophical differences, to face our shared challenges. And I'm doing my level best to bring that spirit here to Washington, D.C., especially now in this time of shutdowns and ultimatums and ideology that doesn't make sense to the people I represent in Colorado. And I want to invite all my colleagues to come to Colorado and show them the collaboration that's occurring in these flood-ravaged communities like Jamestown and Lyons and Estes Park, Fort Morgan. There's no games. There's no posturing. There's no politics. There's just a doggedness to make their communities better. And I would surely hope that the strength and the focus of Coloradans could be an inspiration to all of us here as we tackle what are very, very pressing policy issues. And on that note, I want to talk about one of my constituents, someone who I work for, Jeff. He's a federal employee, and he demonstrates the resilience to me of the people of Colorado. But his situation also typifies the worst of what this shutdown and this brinksmanship is doing to the real people, the good people of my state of Colorado. Jeff is a federal employee. He was trapped for 3 days in last month's flood. That flood cost him almost everything. He has very few possessions left. Once he was freed, he went immediately back to his day job. He was working for an agency that's integral to the flood disaster response. What happened? The government closed. So now he rents out an apartment. His home is inaccessible, literally, due to the flooding. He doesn't have a paycheck, and he's being told he's not essential and that he shouldn't come into work. There are a lot of reactions that I have to that. There are a lot of reactions that anybody that's paying attention would have to that. One of them is that that's one less pair of boots on the ground helping with the flood response efforts in Colorado. And look, Mr. President, to a certain extent, politics is about finding the right strategy to advocate for what you believe is right. But what's going on right now, Mr. President, it's shameful. What's happening to Jeff is just flat out shameful. What we're seeing is one faction of one party and one chamber and one branch of government holding this nation's health, economy, and security hostage, and in the process causing the federal government to shut down and threatening a government default on our obligations. By doing so, these individuals are holding our flood recovery hostage. It makes no sense. I guess, Mr. President, you've got to ask yourself why. Why would a small group, faction, be doing this? It strikes me that in part they're doing it because they're obsessed with undermining a law that's providing affordable health care to Americans, some for the first time in their lives, a law that's saving seniors hundreds of dollars a year on prescription drugs, and is leveling the playing field when it comes to providing health care and putting consumers back in charge of their own health care. Mr. President, Madam President, I want to make this clear. After having legally passed both houses of Congress, being affirmed by the Supreme Court, and then serving as a referendum in the just concluded campaign that overwhelmingly re-elected President Obama, the Affordable Care Act is settled law. Let me say that again. The Affordable Care Act is settled law. But describing it as settled law alone, I know, isn't enough to resolve this latest crisis. So I'd like to take viewers and my colleagues back a decade when the presiding officer was a member of the House at that time as well, when George W. Bush, President George W. Bush, pushed us to pass what was an unpaid-for Medicare prescription drug benefit. Members of my caucus over in the House felt that this massive unpaid law was thrust upon us without due consideration and at a time when we shouldn't have been racking up further debt. And many of us on my side of the aisle were literally reeling with anger after it passed. It also passed in ways that, with which we disagreed in the middle of the night, literally. And the desk in the House was kept open, I think, as the presiding officer remembers, for close to 4 hours to find those last votes. I was angry. I'd voted against that Medicare prescription drug benefit. But I am sure I was as angry as some of my colleagues were when the Affordable Care Act passed over 3 years ago. So what did I do? I took a lot of deep breaths. I listened to the counsel of people I respect. I listened to my own counsel. And I not only decided it was settled law, but I decided to begin holding town halls and listening sessions so I could help my constituents sign up for it. I knew it was the settled law of the land, just like Obamacare is today, and I wanted my constituents to be best served by its implementation. So I went out and spread the word about the benefits, figured out what questions my constituents would have. I wanted them to sign up. I wanted to make it a success. I wanted them to have those benefits. So let's fast forward to today. Far from helping people, our friends and colleagues on the other side of the aisle have relentlessly spread uncertainty about Obamacare, attacked its implementation at every turn, and now have closed down the federal government over their concerns about it. We're in the 10th day of a government shutdown. Our national security is suffering. 70% of the intelligence community is furloughed. We don't have enough food inspectors on the job. Our veterans are not getting the services not only that they need, but they've earned. Our national parks are closed. It's hurt economies like ours in Colorado. I mentioned Estes Park. Estes Park is the gateway to Rocky Mountain National Park. If Estes Park is going to recover from these devastating floods, Rocky Mountain National Park has to be open for business. This isn't how the greatest nation in the world can go on doing business. Now, I've said from the very beginning, I know the presiding officer, I think she agrees with me, the Affordable Care Act is far from perfect. No man-made law is. And as with every law, it will undoubtedly need some improvements and some constructive changes during its implementation. And I'm committed to doing that, just like we did after President Bush moved his prescription drug law to the finish line. Now, in the past few days, we've seen statements indicating that some Republicans are starting to understand that this partisan focus on Obamacare is futile. So, as their next step, they've seized on yet another destructive tactic, manufacturing a new crisis, an even more serious potentially devastating crisis than shutting down the government. What have they done? They're threatening the full faith and credit of the federal government to push their budget demands. They've threatened to force us past the deadline, which is October 17th, that's a week from today, when the United States will no longer be able to meet its financial obligations. Grandstanding on funding the government is bad enough, Madam President, but if we don't agree on a way forward to reopen the government, but we also don't agree on a way to ensure that the Treasury Department doesn't default on our nation's debt obligations, we will seriously damage global confidence in the United States. Make no mistake, there are some voices in this building who think that that won't happen. They are wrong. If we damage the global confidence in the United States, we're going to hamper our economic recovery. We will slow job creation. We'll make borrowing costs more expensive for government and families alike. This is no way to win the global economic race in which we find ourselves. Coloradans are telling me in every way they can that they expect a lot better than this. Ronald Reagan used to joke in only the way that he could that he wasn't worried about the debt. It's big enough to take care of itself. But every American should worry if Congress refuses to meet the obligations we've already made. Now, I know many Americans are worried about our debt and our capacity to pay the bills we've incurred. I've been worried about this for a long time. And I think if you'd ask anybody around here, they'd tell you that I'd vote in a minute for a sensible grand bargain. It's true. I've worked across the aisle and built a record of efforts to reduce wasteful spending and set our budget on a more sustainable footing. It should be one of our top priorities. It has to be one of our top priorities. I've been a longtime supporter of the line item veto. I supported the initial structure around which the Simpson-Bowles Deficit Reduction Commission worked. I called for an end to earmarks. I worked with Senator Coburn from Oklahoma on ending some wasteful public subsidies, including those for the political party conventions every 4 years. And it's why I was the first Democrat to champion a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution in many a year. I'm not the only member as well, Madam President, of my party that's been fighting for common sense reforms. This is critically important work. I would love nothing more than to bring a serious deficit reduction plan to the floor and pass it along with raising our debt limit to avoid an American default. But let me be crystal clear. To default on our debt because a grand bargain eludes us would make our debt and deficits even worse and thrust us into an economic tailspin. It's irresponsible to even suggest forcing America into default is a legitimate negotiating position. Let's sit down and have a grown-up discussion about these important issues, but not like this. Let's fund the government, let's pay our bills, and then let's sit down and negotiate again. Negotiation is good. Compromise is good. But we cannot have this important set of discussions with one party constantly threatening to shut down the government or throw our country into default, each of which makes our deficits and debt even worse. We've got literally centuries of examples of a Congress collaborating and working together, and we've done that for over 200 years. We can debate. We can have contentious back and forth. But in the end, we need to compromise and agree. We need a comprehensive and balanced deficit reduction plan that can pass both chambers and be passed into law. Madam President, no party gets to threaten the American economy and shut down the government when they don't get their way. No party gets to jeopardize middle-class families' 401ks or senior citizens' retirement savings or set our economic recovery back just because their positions aren't strong enough to prevail on their own. That just isn't the way to address our nation's shared problems. And trust me, our debt and deficits are a shared problem. We can do better. Madam President, I want to begin to conclude by In referring to the Coloradans, I'm so fortunate to represent, just like the presiding officer, I know is honored to represent the good people of Wisconsin. Coloradans have shown the true strength of our state in the wake of this tragic flooding that literally has wiped communities off the map and destroyed thousands of homes. If we could have done anything to prevent that natural disaster, we would have. We now face a potential man-made disaster. We've got to protect Americans from a looming man-made disaster that's emerging right here. We've got to bridge the partisan divide. We have to end this government shutdown. We have to stave off an American default. We have to pay our bills. We could do this today if Speaker Boehner would just allow the House to vote on a clean funding resolution that we've already sent to the House, with the House numbers in it, by the way. So let's just see a vote in the House. The continuing resolution would pass the House today with Republican and Democratic votes. So let's just vote. Let's hold the vote. The presiding officer and I served in the House, and when we were eager to go to work, we would shout, vote, 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 work, work, work. It's time for the House to go to work. Let's vote to end this debt ceiling crisis and make sure that our nation pays the debts that it's already incurred. These are the basic functions of Congress. If we fail to act, history will never forgive us, any of us. Madam President, I yield the floor. Madam President.
The senator from Colorado.
I have 4 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet today during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I'd ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to discuss the multiple issues that have now presented themselves to us here in the Senate and to the United States Congress and, frankly, the American people. I've been in several hearings this morning. The first was with Secretary of Treasury Jack Lew, where the Finance Committee discussed with him the pending expiration of our debt ceiling and what his understanding is of how that will impact the country. He raised a lot of serious concerns, very legitimate serious concerns that others are raising. We then followed that up with a hearing in the Banking Committee, where we had representatives from a number of the various industries in the United States also discussing what is going to happen in the United States if the country does not increase the debt ceiling. And there are serious consequences that will happen if we don't do this. But what I tried to do in both of those hearings, and I'll refer to my conversation with Secretary Lew, was to focus us back on the broader, bigger threat. Secretary Lew basically said that we have a manufactured crisis here in the United States because of our unwillingness at this point to face the debt ceiling and simply extend the debt ceiling without any kinds of conditions or negotiations. And I reminded him that the crisis we face is, the big crisis we face is the debt crisis. And it's very real. And I guess, in a sense, it has been manufactured over the last 20 or 30 years by Congresses and presidents who have refused to control spending and have put us into tremendous debt. Our debt ceiling that we are negotiating about right now, or I think wishing we could negotiate about right now, is $16.7 trillion. It's grown by trillions of dollars over the last 5 or 6 years. And what the President has asked us to do is to once again increase the debt ceiling by another $1 trillion or more with no reforms, no fiscal changes in our policies to deal with the mounting spending crisis that we face. The President's position is, you give me this $1 trillion or more of new debt authority, and I will then talk to you about reforming our fiscal policy. The problem is that we've been trying to negotiate over fiscal policy now and trying to get reforms put into place for years, and we have not been able to get there. When I asked Secretary Lew about this, he basically said, you know, we've made progress on our overall debt crisis in the past few years, and I think that we can continue to work on those kinds of steps if you will simply pass this clean debt ceiling and do so in a way that involves no negotiations from the President in any way. I reminded him that a major part of the progress that we have made in the last couple of years was made when we met the debt ceiling 2 years ago, in 2011. And it was the Budget Control Act that put into statute over $2 trillion of reductions in our spending path, and that was attached to the debt ceiling as we moved forward. And it was literally a debt ceiling negotiation that generated the only significant spending controls that this Congress, that this country has seen for years and years. And yet the President refuses to take another step, now that we've met the debt ceiling again, and negotiate for further reforms. While we have, and by the way, there is another reason that we've made some progress in the past few years, and that is that we have implemented massive new taxes on the American people. The Obamacare legislation itself contains nearly $1 trillion of new taxes, and they are now, though they were delayed for a few years, they are now beginning to fully hit the American people. And last January, the President was able to win his argument and succeed in getting the top income tax brackets raised. An impact on our tax code that I think was harmful rather than helpful, and clearly was damaging to the creation of jobs and to businesses across the United States. But nevertheless, another $500 to $600 billion of tax revenue was put into the mix there. So what have we done? We've made a plan to control discretionary spending over the next 10 years and reduce it by about $2 trillion. If we stick to that, we'll get $2 trillion worth of spending reductions. We've raised taxes by at least $1.6 trillion over the next 10 years, all of which I believe has been harmful to our economy, but has generated revenue to try to help reduce the debt cycle. But we have not addressed the two critical parts of reform that we must address in this country if we are ever to get control of our spending excesses and stop the out-of-control spiraling toward insolvency that we see. And that is reforming our entitlement system and reforming our broken tax code. What have we seen there? Virtually minimal, if any at all, reforms of entitlements. They seem to be off the table. Yet they are the part of our spending problem that is the biggest and the most out of control. And on tax reform, we've seen no reform of the tax code. We have a tax code that is the most unfair, the most complicated, the most expensive to comply with, and the most anti-competitive code we probably could have created if we did it on purpose. And yet we have no reforms of the code, and instead what we have done is add to the code another $1.6 trillion of new taxes on the American people. And what we are asking is whether we can move forward in trying to deal with our fiscal problems in this country by negotiating over entitlement reform and tax reform. And I frankly believe that we ought to be at the negotiating table talking about that. But what we've been told is, no, as soon as you will raise the debt ceiling by, and the amount that we are hearing is somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 trillion, as soon as you will raise the debt ceiling, then we can talk further about other negotiations. Then we can get engaged on trying to deal with our debt crisis. I pointed out, as I said, to Secretary Liu that the last major progress we made on spending reform happened in negotiations relating to our debt ceiling. Why can't we negotiate now and make significant fiscal reform in addition to dealing with our debt ceiling? It's that debt crisis that is the biggest problem. I was on the Bowles-Simpson Commission, the President's own commission that he put together some years back, 2 or 3 years now. And we spent a full year studying the impacts on our economy of America's fiscal excesses and what we needed to do. And the Bowles-Simpson Commission came up with a plan. It was a proposal. We concluded that we needed to, and this was 2 or 3 years back, but we needed to reduce our spending path, our debt path in the United States by at least $4 trillion. We concluded that we had to deal with that by reforming our entitlement system, and we had to deal with it by controlling discretionary spending, and we agreed to having some of that tax revenue that the President was demanding. And we also agreed that in the overall mix that we would have about a 3-to-1 ratio of revenue to spending, of spending cuts to revenue. The President did not accept that recommendation. And many of us tried for months and months and months afterward to get that recommendation to the floor for a vote. But it has not made it to the floor for a vote. My point is, negotiations have been underway for years and years, and significant plans have been developed that would help us move forward. We know what to do. We need to have the will to do it. And so far, the only reforms that we've been able to get in the last few years as a result of the debt crisis that we face have come when we've met these pressure points dealing with our debt ceiling. We're not asking to shut down the government for the purposes of simply making a point. We are trying to get to negotiations. We want to see the government reopened. We are not seeking to have the debt ceiling expire. We want to have negotiations to be able to put together the kinds of fiscal reforms that should always accompany extensions of the debt ceiling. I believe the reason that Congress put statutory debt ceilings in place in the first place was because they wanted to give America a gut check every so often about the spending problems that we have. We've put almost half of the entire spending system of the government on autopilot, and we don't even have the opportunities to vote on it here in Congress. Madam President, ultimately, we have to deal with the debt ceiling, and ultimately, we have to deal with the funding to keep our government operational. Let's not just move forward and accomplish those objectives, leaving in place the unrestrained fiscal crisis that we are dealing with in this country. Let's use this opportunity to put together the kinds of fiscal reforms that should accompany decisions to allow our country to increase its debt. And with that, Madam President, I yield my time. There's nothing. Madam President, I note
The Senator from Idaho.
I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call a roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Republican whip.
President, I'd ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Madam President, yesterday I came to the floor with the distinguished majority leader to raise the issue of survivor benefits to those who died in the line of duty. Reportedly, 26 service members have died since the government shut down on October the 1st, including 5 in combat, and they've been denied the basic survivor benefits their families have, which include a death gratuity, $100,000 of life insurance, a housing allowance for a year paid in a lump sum, as well as burial and other related expenses. Yesterday I asked unanimous consent that we take up and pass a House bill, and the majority leader and I entered into a conversation, and there was a question of whether the intervening action by the Department of Defense to try to work around the lapse of the funding. And Fisher House, which is just a wonderful charitable organization, they help operate and fund 7 different facilities in my state alone, and I know they're extraordinarily generous, and they do very good work. They offered to enter into a contractual agreement with the Department of Defense to fill the gap during the interim, but what I'd like to do is ask unanimous consent that we take up and pass the House legislation, which would alleviate the need for Fisher House and the Department of Defense trying to figure a workaround. We'd actually pass legislation that would reopen that stream of funding so that these families can get the benefits they deserve. So I would ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to consideration of calendar number 216, H.J.Res 91, making continuing appropriations for survivor benefits for survivors of deceased military members for fiscal year 2014, that the measure be read a 3rd time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid on the table.
Madam President.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
The majority leader.
Reserving the right to object. The senior senator from Texas has been always very courteous to me. Yesterday was no exception in withholding his unanimous consent request when we discussed this issue. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as he indicated. And I indicated I thought if we waited till 3:30 we would have this matter resolved. That's what I had been told, and in fact it was. A little after 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, Secretary Hagel issued a statement announcing the Department of Defense had entered an agreement, as my friend said, with the organization that my friend mentioned. And that would provide the family of fallen service members. Over the weekend, this senator from Texas is right. We had 4 soldiers killed, one of whom was a woman, 4 men and 1 woman. And the agreement that Senator Hagel came up with would give everyone, to provide fallen family members who are in the military, a full set of benefits they've been promised, including the $100,000 death benefit gratuity. So the death benefit issues has been resolved. The Department of Defense stepped forward and took care of everything. And so this issue is largely moot. It's clear the action on this legislation is now just for show here. We all agreed that it was a bad thing that the government shutdown led to this added grief for the families who had suffered such a terrible loss. Now we need to do what we can to prevent any further bad results, and there have been plenty of them in other areas. The right thing to do is to prevent more of these in other areas, and the House should just vote and open the government. The issue has been taken care of, and it's terrible that we even got to this point. But we shouldn't forget, as long as the government remains closed and the House Republicans refuse to reopen the government, the military is unable to, for example, buy armor and equipment needed to prevent future deaths in the military. Families of FBI agents killed in the line of duty, same problem. They can't receive their death benefits. Veterans' benefits are delayed and disrupted. So, Madam President, as for this bill today, the Secretary has now acted. We all agree that its issues taken care of, but if my friend from Texas feels more comfort as a result of doing this, which I think is unnecessary,